Stop me if this sounds familiar. Late period Sony PS4 title receives PS5 Remaster. Yes, it's yet another Sony refurbishing bonanza, this time focusing on Sony Ben's underappreciated 2019 gem Days Gone. But unlike other recent PS5 remastering efforts, this is much more than a simple resolution bump or framerate enhancement, packing new lighting effects that can transform the game's appearance. So does Days Gone stick the landing on PS5 and PS5 Pro consoles? Can Sony bend improve on the PS4 code without introducing visual compromises along the way? Most remasters focus on two things, resolution and frame rate. But Days Gone Remastered is very different, with a substantial overhaul of the game's lighting, especially at night. Before, Days Gone had unusually bright nighttime scenes that appeared more like overcast dusk than a true night sky. Ambient light spilled out over the scene, and the moon shot strong directional light over the environment, even a tiny crescent moon. Games often depict nighttime scenes in relatively bright conditions for gameplay reasons and visual readability, but Days Gone was a particularly stark example. With the revised lighting, the game appears much darker in the same circumstances. Just take a look at this scene on the bike. The headlights blast into the darkness much more realistically, the ambient light has much less luminance, and the direct light from the moon is nearly non-existent. It's a much more true-to-life depiction of the actual conditions at night with a bright artificial light source. Still shots show a substantial difference as well. These scenes at the Wizard Island camp have a strong contrast, with scorching near-white artificial lights embedded within an indigo-blue environment. A view of the sky overhead reveals a darker cast and far more visible stars, just like the sky should in an area with near-zero light pollution. On my mini LED-based TV, these nighttime views can have surprising visual impact. Depending on the conditions and surrounding lights though, sometimes the difference is less pronounced. Plus, the game never really reaches true darkness in outdoor conditions, presumably largely for gameplay reasons. Freaker fights are balanced around being able to make out enemies at range, and that is only somewhat diminished in this new iteration. Visibility shouldn't be too much of an issue, but that goes out the window somewhat for cutscenes, which can be extremely dark. The opening cutscene is perhaps the best example, with dramatically crushed ambient light and a bright highlight-rich appearance. Cutscenes in Days Gone seem to have undergone a lot of tweaking, and that's most evident in nighttime scenes. This point-blank, pitch-black face-off also gets a substantial overhaul. Again though, some cinematics have more subtle tweaks. Two early cutscenes at Copeland's camp are only slightly darker than the outgoing code. Even here though, they've been substantially relit, with much stronger lighting from the fires. The backlights and keylights have a real intensity now, and work with the subsurface scattering to produce a sense of translucency on skin. Even though the assets and animation appear very similar between these two versions, the updated lighting gives this discussion a dark mood that wasn't present before. That's not the only tweak, because Sony Bend and co-developer Climax Studios have overhauled the game's lighting simulation during other conditions as well. According to the developers, they've updated the game to use a 16-band spectral model instead of computing sky scattering calculations in RGB, and they've simulated more phenomena within that model, like ozone absorption. Here, for instance, the sky has a much more vibrant shade of blue behind the cloud cover. This is reflected in a cooler world that takes that light blue contribution when it calculates the indirect lighting for any given scene. Overcast conditions are usually affected the most, as you might expect. There are other lighting tweaks as well. Screen space global illumination has been adapted here from the PC release, which has a subtle but impactful effect on the game. This is most noticeable in indoor scenes. Note the subtle bounced light from the wallpaper on the ceiling here, for instance, or how the couch no longer has that smudgy SSAO outline at its base. It's seen some evolution over the PC code, and I think it does improve the game's appearance. It also has an impact outdoors, most notably in the grass, which has lighter occlusion at its base. Shadow resolution has also been improved, doubled according to the game's development staff. Some shadows appear only marginally sharper, like Deacon's shadow here, but most environmental shadows have much crisper and less aliased outlines. This can trade off a bit with realism in some circumstances though, like how this chain link fence leaves a strong stencil of occluded light even many feet away. There are other tweaks as well. Texture resolution gets a bump, for instance, as the game's texture streaming has been improved in accordance with the PS5's doubled memory. Screen space reflections appear more accurate, though some of the puddles appear to be bugged now. Deacon also now has a flashlight hanging from his chest, which has been added to explain his in-game flashlight ability. But in general, the vast majority of the visual differences come down to the game's lighting overhaul. There is one change though that I really don't understand. Days Gone now has a configurable FOV, which is a helpful addition to improve comfort, but the default value is 70 degrees, while the original game is closer to 76 in my testing, perhaps falling between 76 and 77. I don't understand why this was changed. Even more befuddling, the FOV in cutscenes was also lowered, but the in-game FOV settings have zero impact on these scripted scenes. These always appear slightly zoomed relative to the original shots, no matter what you do. I've used a value of 76 for the vast majority of the capture in this video for consistency's sake. I think Days Gone Remastered is a success on a visual level in a lot of ways, but it's bound to be controversial when it comes to image quality. The PS4 code on PS5 ran at 60 FPS, mostly at a checkerboarded 4K resolution. It wasn't perfect as foliage and hair could artifact and alias with the checkerboarding technique, but it was quite sharp. The base PS5 in performance mode here runs at 1440p with no temporal upsampling process like FSR2 to improve clarity, leaving it somewhat soft and imprecise relative to the PS4 code. There is some DRS on the horizontal axis here, along with every other mode on PS5 and PS5 Pro, although I didn't find evidence of it in typical play. The extent to which you can perceive the clarity difference will depend on your display and how far you tend to sit from it, but in side-to-sides it's clearly less detailed than the version we've had for the past 4.5 years on PS5 consoles. Image stability is typically comparable, but image sharpness takes a considerable backseat. There are some minor advantages, most obviously in eliminating checkerboarding artifacts and screen space effects, but on the whole, I think it is an inferior image. Frame rates do see a bump over that vintage code, thankfully. The PS4 version on PS5 wasn't a perfectly locked 60 FPS. Open world traversal at speed tended to drop a frame frequently, which could annoy slightly. On foot or during most combat, this wasn't an issue, but riding through the world felt a little stuttery. Plus, very large-scale combat could suffer from significant performance drops, though these were usually only noticeable when dealing with especially massive freaker hordes in challenge mode. VRR unfortunately couldn't help out the PS4 code on PS5, as VRR is disabled for PS4 software. In the native PS5 code, those little hitches are totally ironed out in my experience, producing a perfectly smooth ride through the game's post-apocalyptic environments. This is the most significant frame rate improvement in typical play. Combat with large masses of freaker hordes still suffers from drops occasionally, though they are smaller than the older code. Less massive groupings of freakers, like in the game's new Horde Assault mode, run without issue. Loading times have also been improved, albeit by more modest margins. In my testing across 3 loads, the game emerges into gameplay about 10 to 12 seconds faster than its PS4-derived counterpart. It's not the lightning-quick storage to pixels response that we're used to seeing from current-generation titles like Forspoken, but I don't think it's egregious either. And once you're in-game, it's mostly a loading time-free experience outside of fast travel and certain breaks between cutscenes. Quality mode steps up image clarity dramatically, rendering typically at an actual native 4K resolution. It's sharper than both the versions we've surveyed so far, the performance mode at 1440p and the PS4 code at a CBR 4K. It's also more stable than both those iterations and doesn't suffer from any checkerboarding gremlins. It's a very satisfying image in my experience, and in particular excels at depicting fine foliage detail relative to the 2 others. Other top-line tweakables appear unchanged, like foliage draw-in, though the increased resolution helps you to appreciate the detail that is present in the game. Obviously though, that improved image quality does force you to swallow a 30 FPS framerate target. It's essentially a locked 30 FPS in my experience, as I didn't log any drops even in the most technically challenging encounters. I think that decrease in fluidity and temporal detail probably isn't worth the image quality bump to most players. 1440p 60 is a common standard in current gen software for a reason, and I think it's decent enough here, even if image quality is arguably a step down from the PS4 code. Moving on to Sony's new PS5 Pro console, we get 3 new mode options: a performance mode, a quality mode, and an enhanced mode that uses PSSR. The performance mode is essentially identical to the base PS5 performance mode, except that the resolution target is bumped to 1800p instead of 1440p. In practice, the visual difference is fairly slim, though the clarity and temporal stability of the image is improved somewhat. The old code running at 4K with CBR remains king in detail resolved, though checkerboarding artifacts obviously get the boot on Pro. But that's not the only 60fps mode available on PS5 Pro consoles. There's also an enhanced mode, which renders internally at 1584p and upscales that image using PSSR. The enhanced mode has a certain noisiness to it that can annoy slightly, and PSSR can expose low-resolution edges during movement. Plus, foliage can blur heavily when it's being blown about, as it does during these stormy conditions, and often suffers from distracting noise and shimmer. The enhanced mode is much sharper, however, close to the old checkerboarding solution. In typical play, it usually looks fine enough, absent some of the foliage issues. I'm really not sure which one I would pick overall. Both of these modes perform very well. Traversal hitches are out of the picture, and the large frequent encounters actually drop frames less often than PS5. In typical play, I'd expect both to feel like a locked 60fps experience, barring extremely large freaker hordes in the game's challenge mode. Finally, the Pro packs a quality mode. This option apparently renders at a full 5K resolution, or 2880p, which is downscaled to 4K in my captures. It does look marginally cleaner than the PS5 quality mode, though the differences are quite subtle. I think the two are mostly indistinguishable. Again, we're at a 30fps frame rate target, and again it runs without issue. Expect to lock 30fps even in extremely intense fights. I suspect most players, though, will favor the 60fps targeting modes here. Time has been good to Days Gone, in more ways than one. The graphics, for instance, remain quite beautiful. Its expert use of Unreal Engine 4 produced lush forests with tons of foliage detail, and crisp screen space shadows to give the underbrush appropriate depth. Despite a dynamic time of day, the game's lighting looked superb in open-world spaces, and the materials had a filmic PBR-driven appearance. It still compares favorably to many modern titles, and managed to run at a decent clip on 2013 vintage PS4 hardware. But it's important to recognize some of the game's limitations as well. Lighting was considerably less pleasing in interiors than exteriors, and many indoor spaces suffered from substantial light leaking. The game's shadows and AO depended heavily on screen space information, which could lead to ugly occlusion issues when said information wasn't available. Modern AAA games have evolved greatly in some ways, like solving more complex lighting using ray tracing to provide accurate diffused GI in tight spaces, and improvements in asset quality and continuous LOD systems help to make games look ultra-detailed, even with close scrutiny. But I certainly sympathize with the sentiment that games like Days Gone and other late last-gen heavy hitters still manage to hold their own today, and critically can run with solid frame rates and image quality on current generation console hardware. I also suspect that the game will probably be received more warmly now than it did at launch. At the time of its release, a certain fatigue had set in regarding open-world action games, and Days Gone didn't necessarily hit it out of the park in every respect. Side content was a bit on the simpler side, and the gunplay could feel a little stiff and inflexible. Plus, the game's story didn't seem quite as colorful or easily relatable as some of its contemporaries. But if you primarily understand the game as a story-driven, single-player experience with an open world and side content more as set dressing, more like Spider-Man than Cyberpunk, I think it more than holds its own. That especially holds true on PS5 and PS5 Pro systems, where a solid 60fps experience is easily achievable, greatly improving the game's raw mechanical feel. Plus, driving around on the in-game bike is still delightful, especially once you pack on a few upgrades. The results are generally good in this remastering effort, though not exceptional. The revised lighting and boosted settings are definitely an advantage, as is performance, but there is a substantial image quality trade-off here, at least on base PS5 consoles. The Pro fares better against the original code, but its performance modes still aren't a clean upgrade over the original checkerboarding, flawed as it might be. The game is set to receive some additional options, a 40 FPS mode on both consoles, and extra VRR-enabled unlocked modes, which should be arriving in an upcoming patch. My preference would probably be for the locked 60 FPS modes that we currently have, however. Plus, there's the basic reality that the PS4 code already ran very well on PS5 consoles. Like The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, Ghost of Tsushima Director's Cut, and Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, there's a compelling case to make that resources could have been expended elsewhere. My first Days Gone playthrough actually took place on the PS5 in late 2020, and I felt like that was a perfectly good experience at the time. There are a lot of other games in Sony's first-party stable that are begging for native PS5 versions, especially from the PS2 and PS3 generations. Overall though, I think at a $10 asking price, Days Gone Remastered has done enough to warrant a try for fans of the original, and offers a somewhat more compelling option for new players than the PS4 code. It's not the most critical remastering effort around, but it's a definite improvement in many respects over what we had before. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch use social media. Thanks for watching.